Hey Hofstra Romans, sorry I cannot be with you this year. This is one of my favorite trips in the entire world, and I'm hoping you're going to enjoy it. So from what I understand, this video is the first video that you're seeing on the trip for educational purposes, and welcome to Rome. That's pretty amazing. So my name is Dr. Jamie Cohen. I've been on this trip, I think 5 times, and I've been all over Rome at this point. I want to talk to you a little bit about how you could start thinking about some of the things you're going to see. One of the biggest questions that comes up during the trip from many of the students and almost everybody who goes to Rome is, what is time? Like, how does this make sense? You are about to explore the Eternal City, and they call it the Eternal City for multiple reasons. But I think what we have to understand is that eternal means that you're only a small part of that timeline. It means that in the future, there'll be more people after you and people who came before you. And one of the most amazing things about being in a place, in a piece of land that's been around for 3,000 years, is to understand how much has changed in that space. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about how you could rethink time and keep this in the back of your mind as you go on adventure and see all these different sites. Being a human means that we interact with time in a linear way. What happens now is part of the past. And as I'm speaking, it's part of the present, which becomes immediately part of the past. And when you're watching this, you're watching something that took place in the past, but you're experiencing it in real time in your present, which becomes your past. That's just life. That's how it goes. When a minute goes by, so does the time, and it just keeps on going. You can't stop that beating of time. But what you could start doing is thinking about how time actually operates. The difference between how we interact with time and the way that archaeologists interact with time is slightly different. Archaeologists are humans, so they do know, of course, that time exists in one way, and if you make a mistake, it exists and you can't undo it. It only goes in one direction. But we also have to think about the idea that stratigraphically, time can be discovered by digging downward, that you could find time or go through time by digging, by working your way through the dirt. Let me explain how archaeologists see time. You're going to go to a handful of archaeology digs, and some digs are active, as in like they're being dug right now. And some are exhibits, places that you could go and they've been finished. I'm going to talk about 2 major sites during this video. One is the Basilica di San Clemente, which is what Randy will refer to as churchception. It's a church within a church within a church. It's this very interesting structure that was built on top of other structures. And the other one is the Church of Santa Maria in Trastevere. And I want to talk about those in 2 different ways, but both have a lot to do with time and the people who were there at the time. Archaeologists see time vertically because they understand how geologically the Earth itself stacks up. Think about it in this way. If you build your house on your property, or you have it, it means you've stacked up the ground. It's higher now. You could literally be floating above where something wasn't years ago. You've been stacked up. Time has built the leveling up. But when we go down through the dirt, thinking about how geology matters ties us to what's known as the historical record. The historical record are things that we know. They're facts. They're things that we know about history. So if we know a big flood happened in 1892, we know that because all over the place you could find evidence of a flood. If you know that an earthquake happened in 538 AD, you could tell that because that happened in multiple accounts. That's what's known as the historical record. But an archaeologist looks further. And the reason they do that is because they're really interrogating what it means to think about culture. Now, culture itself is a moving object. And culture often makes itself into history books, telling people who won, who lost, who's in charge, who was doing what. But as you know by now, history books are written by the winner, which means that history isn't exactly accurate. Storytelling is subjective to those who have power. Those without power don't get the ability to keep their narratives running for the rest of eternity. So what archaeologists do is they dig to correct the historical record. That's really the goal. And what that means is when they dig down, they find out more data about the past and are able to tell a more fulfilling story. But what it also reveals is the real stories about people. People. Not famous people, not senators, not rich people. People. Like you and me, just people who happen to exist that don't really have a historical record. Archaeologists work with that because every person is significant in their storytelling ability and their lives as it matters to the overall narrative of the world. But archaeologists are very interested in very specific things. So archaeology, as you'll see on your trip, has a few problems and criticisms that I'd like to talk about. One is that archaeologists, in the classical sense, typically dig rich people. They want to find gold and gems and jewels and cool things and all these other things. And that is very much exclusive. It means that we don't really know what the normal or the common populace would do. And that's something that was left out of archaeology for quite some time. And this was a very common problem in archaeology up until recently. And I mean really recently, like the 1970s, when they started thinking about a new way of seeing archaeology. James Dietz wrote the book In Small Things Forgotten and started thinking about what does it mean to be just a common person? What does that mean to just have things? And what is that contribution to culture? And it really unearthed two really important concepts about objects and study and cultural artifacts, which is what archaeologists are digging down to. And one is that let's say you're digging down these layers and you find an event, so to speak. So that could be a house burning down. You find a layer of burn. That layer of burn could have been vertical and then collapsed down into a layer. That's how we know when time exists. When you go down there, you have to understand that each layer is time. And so when you get to a certain point, you're like, okay, currently this layer I'm working on is temporal. That means this spoon that I found here has a relation to the human in 1800. But if I dig another 10 feet, I may end up in the year 1000, and that spoon may have a different meaning altogether. They may have done two different things, although you know them as one use. And the reason for that is that culture itself adjusts. It changes the way that we use tools. It changes the way we interact with things. The other most important thing of this is site specificity. Site specificity is the thing has to exist right there. There's a reason you're in Rome. You're in Rome because it's site specific. You can't take Rome somewhere else. Rome is the place, but it's also the collection of all these archaeological events that are only discoverable by digging downward. Now here's a quote that I think is important to keep in mind because you're going to visit a lot of ruins. Architecture is the medium of the ruin. That's an important quote. That quote is important because every time you see a building, it is a ruin. It just isn't a ruin yet. But in your timeline, it's currently architecture. But every time you visit a ruin, it was once architecture, which means architecture itself is a medium. Much like this video, this digital data is the medium of this type of content. So the digital, the ones and zeros on this card, end up being part of the archaeological record. However, it's digital, which means there's a little bit more to do that, and that's called media archaeology, which in this video we won't go into too much in depth, but if you're curious about it, it's a fun study to think about the minerals that make up the cards. But in this case, what we're talking about is really just the stuff, the actual physical medium. So when you find papyrus from a certain time, you know what's said on it at that time. When you find a building, you know when the building was made, but now it might be a ruin because time itself has taken over that. So let me talk about several places and things. First, you're going to see a lot of sculptures, of course, but there's a huge difference between a sculpture and graffiti, and I need you to keep this in mind. In Jason Farman's mobile storytelling, he talks about site-specific mobile journalism, and that type of journalism is about thinking about what it means to be site-specific and part of that structure, that class structure. And the reason I talk about class is because sculptures are typically made for rich people. They're typically made for an upper class. They're made for people who had the money and the means to create that type of object. The downside is that sculpture once found or once dug up usually moves to a museum. It's never really where it was. Sometimes occasionally they'll leave it there just to show it, but most typically the place where it was buried has been built over. Most of Rome, 99% of Rome, is on top of the previous iteration of Rome. You could find some parts of the city, like Trastevere or the Forum area, that are part of what it would look like originally, but for the most part, you're standing on top of the other city that was just underneath you. You'll find many spaces where you could look down and see what that looks like. On the other hand, lower class artwork, let's call it graffiti or scratch-eaty, when somebody scratches something into the wall. Graffiti itself is site-specific. It was made in that space for some reason. It is part of the person who created it. The nature of the graffiti means it's stuck to that space. So when you encounter it, it means that the site specificity is perfect. It is left there for future. Possibly, there's no way to know if that person was interested in making sure that the receiver of the media knew what they were saying, but what matters is that it cannot be moved like a sculpture can. So there's two different sites that you're going to see on this trip that I really want you to think about what time means. One is the Basilica di San Clemente during one day when you're going to check out churches. At that point, you're going to be inside of time. But before that, I'm hoping at one point you get to go and see the Church of Santa Maria in Trastevere. When you're standing inside of Santa Maria Trastevere, this beautiful church, obviously the ceiling is going to be amazing to look at. You're going to be like, oh my gosh, look how cool this amazing structure is. But instead of looking at the ceiling, take a look around at the columns and see what you notice. Each of the columns inside of this church are from different structures. So the building was originally made in the 3rd century, somewhere in the 200s. The building was made, the structure itself. But it wasn't until almost 1,000 years later that it was fully structured into the building you'll be standing in. And so that means at that point there were ruins everywhere. It was almost 1,000 years after the height of the Roman Empire. When they were moving these ruins, the columns are still useful. So they were able to put them in this church. Now, my favorite place to be in all of Rome is Basilica di San Clemente. And this basilica is amazing because when you're in it, you're standing on top of 2 other major structures lost to time. And they were completely lost because we actually didn't know what those structures were until we started digging downward and finding artifacts underneath one of the churches, which led to archaeologists digging further and finding an entirely other structure underneath that. So when you're standing in this, the big structure on top was built in 1100, about the same time of Santa Maria Trastevere. So think about these 2 churches as the same time. Think about 1,000 years ago in Rome when there's very little structures. Mostly churches were sitting there and everything else was sitting deeply in ruin, which I'll talk about in a second. At this point, when the churches were being built, they were being built on top of things that had previously been there during previous eras. The very first level that you'll end up in is the Mithraean spot, which is basically a little warehouse / rooms and school and this little area of where it once had a courtyard that was down in the first layer. When you're standing on this first layer, you're standing in time. You're standing at the 1st century's level. 40 feet underground is where the ground was 2,000 years ago. In 64 AD, there was a major fire, and that huge fire destroyed most of Rome. It's expensive to remove a lot of materials, so what a lot of people did was just left it and then built on top of it. So the second church, the one underneath it, was really it was a church that became a church later because this happened during the 2nd century when Christianity wasn't yet allowed, but it became the space for worship. And that space for worship was used for hundreds of years until the basilica was structured on top of that around the time that Christianity was able to be not a crime. So around the 4th or 5th century, the big structure appeared there. And then at 1100, you're standing in that building that you could see. This multiple layers of time mean that you're not just being near time, you're in time. The idea of time is interesting with this because 2 ways of interacting with time are to go through time, which means like you're walking. When you're walking, time is going with you. If you're standing still, time is going through you. You can't stop it. But when we're in the ground, when we're inside of these ruins, you are inside of time itself. And what I do want you to realize is that everything you're interacting with when you go through the city is that you're seeing things in our very modern day excavation. When you see the Forum, you have to know that 40 years ago it didn't look like that. So within the last 50 years, that's what's been dug up. It was known as the Campo Vicino, which means cow pasture. And we actually have photographs of what things looked like at that time. So when you're standing looking down into the Forum, or you happen to be across the Forum and you're standing there, you have to understand that your feet are in the exact same level and height as it was 2,000 years ago during the height of their empire. But where you're also standing is 40 feet underneath cow manure. Even if you are one of the greatest cities to have ever been, you will still end up buried in dirt. So remember, you're standing there and you're looking up, and you'd be somewhere like you're standing downtown Manhattan, tall buildings everywhere that look much like the way they do in DC, except they'd be very gaudy yellow and red and bustling. There'd be people everywhere, and there your feet are now. Those people are still there at this moment because we were able to dig down and find them. So what I need you to keep in mind during this trip is to start thinking about time if it was vertical, stacked up on stratigraphy. And where you come in is to understand that politics, culture, life, labor, careers, everything happens with you as part of it. And you're part of that strata at that moment. So when we tell stories about people, ourselves or others, we have to remember that we're telling a story that isn't happening in a vacuum, in a bubble. It happens on a stack. It happens on the things built before it. The reason why Rome or Italy might re-elect fascist people or like engage in that behavior is because you can't fully bury the past. It is still part of that type of reality that we were with. So in America, the United States is very new. To 250 years ago, it wasn't even a country. And that was only a blip in time of the Roman Empire itself. So that's how short of time things can change, and the technology changes, and our ability to tell stories changes, and our ability to communicate across vast spaces without thinking too much about it. So enjoy all these spaces, but really try to think about what it means to be in time and what time does, because that to me is the most important way that we could start rethinking how we tell stories.